Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Director of Education. Thank you to the 2021 Lunch and Learn series sponsor, the Tacoma Jewish Community Fund. The Holocaust Center for Humanity in downtown Seattle sits on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. The Holocaust Center is open on Sundays, and you can reserve your tickets now for the exhibit Finding Light in the Darkness, which highlights the stories of local Holocaust survivors, showcasing artifacts and video testimony. More than 30 years ago, Holocaust survivor Henry Friedman started the annual Holocaust Creative Writing Contest. The contest was in honor of his father, who highly valued education, and his teacher, who spent 18 months in hiding with his family. Over the years, the contest has expanded to include art and film. This year, we received almost 600 entries from students around the state of Washington. The entries represented 55 different schools. I want to share with you a quote from one of the entries we received. One student wrote, "The recognition of and reckoning with the Holocaust forces us to truly examine our humanity in the most extreme environment. Exposing ourselves to the suffering of other humans allows us to recognize our privilege and comprehend the need for compassion. There are many helpful, relevant, and interesting events I have learned about in school. However, none but the Holocaust have made me so achingly in touch with my mortal soul." We will be announcing and awarding all of the winners at a special Lunch and Learn Awards program on June 8th. Please join us as we hear from the student winners and the survivors that inspired them. In December of this past year, The Daily, a podcast by the New York Times, produced a story called "Lovers in Auschwitz, Reunited 72 years later, he had one question." As a regular listener of The Daily, but not really one for love stories, I downloaded the episode and was skeptical. As I listened, my skepticism disappeared, and I found myself wiping away the tears at this remarkable story of survival and will, luck and incredible talent, and the unexpected turns of life that force us to adjust and readjust and readjust again. I was so taken with this story of Cantor David Wisnia, I made a note to myself to find out more about him when I got back to my computer. As luck would have it, that same day, I received an email from Carl Schutoff, my trusted friend and most dedicated volunteer and docent at the Holocaust Center. He wrote, "You must hear this story. It's about a close family friend of mine." And he included a link to the story I had just heard of David Wisnia. I'm grateful to Carl for personally connecting me with Avi Wisnia, the grandson of survivor Cantor David Wisnia. Avi is an award-winning singer, songwriter, storyteller, and educator. He performs in venues around the world, including the Hammerstein Ballroom in New York and the Kennedy Center in DC, with concert tours in Japan, Poland, and Brazil. He has also given a TED Talk and performed with the Moth Storytellers. Avi continues to travel and perform with his grandfather, and his new album of original jazz pop compositions will be released later this year. I'll put the website in the chat so you can check it out later. Avi, it's an honor to have you with us here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Alana, and thank you, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. You know, even though we can't be together in person just yet, I'm really grateful to be able to join you today from my home here in Philadelphia. And I am deeply honored to speak to you as part of this program series that challenges and inspires people of all backgrounds to confront bigotry, prejudice, and indifference, and to consider how your voice can make a difference. Our voices are powerful. They can comfort and they can hurt. They can save lives and they can cause immense destruction. Our voices can bring about change. Our silence is powerful too. As a singer, I love using my voice to connect with others and create shared experience. My grandfather, whose story you are going to hear today, is also a singer, a cantor. And for those of you who might be unfamiliar with the term, a cantor in Judaism is a trained singer who leads a congregation in song and prayer. And I'd like to introduce you to my grandfather with a photo that I have. Here is a picture that I took of my grandfather, Cantor David Wisnia. A few years ago, I took this on one of our trips to Poland, which is where his story takes place. And maybe you can see why he is pointing up at this sign and smiling so big. So in Polish, cantor is the word for money exchange. Now, some cantors are open only during normal business hours, and some are open all the time. And they're called 24-hour nonstop cantors. And that's the joke. That's what I call my grandfather, the 24-hour nonstop cantor, because he's always singing. When he wakes up in the morning, when I call him on the phone, when the diner waitress comes to take our order, he will sing for anyone, anytime. Music is what keeps him going. And music plays a central part in his story. His incredible voice is one of the reasons why he survived the Holocaust. My grandfather was born in Poland, in the town of Sochachev, a suburb outside the capital city, Warsaw. And that's where his parents raised their young family. His father, Eliyahu, owned and operated a furniture factory in the big city. So the family was well off and lived a comfortable life. Little David would help his mother, Machla, who you see here also, prepare her famous chicken and matzo ball soup recipe, which would be ready when Eliyahu came home from work every week for Friday night Shabbat dinner. My grandfather had two brothers, Moshet and Dov. They were all 3 years apart, with David in the middle, as he is in this photo. But David was the star. David could speak 5 languages by the age of 10, and his singing talent was soon discovered by his school teachers. And with the encouragement of his father, Eliyahu, David began singing in theaters and appearing on Polish radio with an orchestra, and performing solos in the grand synagogues of Warsaw. My grandfather trained with world-famous cantors, Kosevitsky and Soroda, mentors who taught him how to blend Jewish tradition with an operatic style. At that time, Poland had a booming Jewish population. Some 3 million Jews lived in the country. And my grandfather's family participated in that thriving Jewish society. Yes, there were episodes of anti-Semitism. Jewish students were often bullied and even beaten by fellow classmates in the public school if they did not stand and say a Catholic prayer in class. My grandfather was one of those students, bullied and beaten for being Jewish. Even still, my grandfather remembers a happy childhood in Poland. Little David could not have imagined that things were going to get much, much worse. When the family moved to Warsaw, my grandfather started to entertain grand dreams of becoming a great opera star. On August 31st, 1939, David became a bar mitzvah, celebrating his 13th birthday, and he looked forward to the opportunity of life in the city. But those dreams were cut short. The very next day, September 1st, Germany invaded Poland, and little by little, things began to change. German soldiers appeared with guns, starting to patrol the streets. Jews were forced to close the businesses they owned. And then Jews had to wear armbands with a Jewish star on them, identifying them. My grandfather remembers when the Germans finally forced all Jews out of their homes and squeezed them into one section of the city which became the Warsaw Ghetto. His family already lived in an apartment within that section, so as my grandfather explains, we didn't go to the ghetto came to us. Suddenly, there were extra people living in the apartment. David and his younger brother, Dove, had to make room by sleeping on the floor. Food was harder and harder to come by. The conditions got so bad, David's older brother, Moshet, said goodbye to the family and snuck out of the ghetto to be with relatives outside the city. But Moshe was never seen again. With the family factory shuttered, Eliyahu was at least able to get work as a carpenter at the main airport in Warsaw. He would leave in a truck every morning, ushered out and back in again by the Germans patrolling the ghetto walls. One morning, Eliyahu asked David to go to work in his place for that day. My grandfather doesn't recall the reason why they switched places, but at the time, it didn't seem important. Life was already tough for everyone in the ghetto, and for a teenager, there was nothing to do. No singing, no entertainment, no freedom. What was thrilling for David was that by taking his father's job for the day, he would get to go outside the ghetto walls for the first time in over a year. Work at the apartment that day would be unremarkable: cleaning, lifting, stacking. But what my grandfather remembers most is the ride in the truck, the sight of the green Polish countryside, the feel of the breeze on his face, the scent of the air. He had forgotten what clean air smelled like, so used to the smell of garbage and human waste that now filled the ghetto streets. Out here, the air was fresh and clean. He drank it in. At the end of the day's work, as the truck returned to the ghetto, David noticed that something was not right. The truck stopped blocks away from where he was supposed to be dropped off. Cautiously, he began to walk the rest of the way back to the apartment on foot. As he got close to his street, he was stopped by guards, more imposing, more menacing looking than the German patrol soldiers. These were the Nazi SS. Halt! They shouted and ordered him to turn around. He thought better than to ask them what was going on or to disobey their command, certainly. Knowing well the alleys and side streets of the city, David was able to approach from a different way. He came across a man crouching down in the alley, hiding. What happened? What's going on? The man described for him a scene. The SS had showed up to a building with bullhorns, ordering everyone out in under 10 minutes. It was a test run to see how quickly they could load people onto trucks. But the people of the building did not get out fast enough. The Nazis shot everyone. My grandfather knew it was dangerous to go further, but he had to know if it was his building. He had to know if his family was okay. He had to know. He approached his building, stepping over broken glass, past the fresh bullet holes in the wall. People were screaming, crying, running, or just standing motionless. In the middle of this chaos was the pile, bodies upon bodies, all heaped together in the street, maybe 10, 12, 15 bodies, dead. He desperately wanted to look away, but he had to know. And then, he saw them there in the pile. His mother's brown camel hair coat, his father's hand, his little brother Dove. He collapsed onto the pile in shock and despair. He doesn't remember how long he cried there. It was until another Jew came and pushed him away from the bodies. After all, the Jews of the ghetto were the ones who had to clean up the mess the Nazi guards had left. David was bewildered. In that instant, he had to decide, what should he do? Where would he go? He was alone in the world. What now? He did the only thing he could think of. He ran. Having ripped off his armband and crawling through an unfinished fence of the ghetto, my grandfather found his way to one of his non-Jewish friends who helped him flee Warsaw. This was the beginning of a series of escapes with the help of non-Jewish neighbors and acquaintances, people who risked their lives to defy the Germans and smuggle him from place to place. But he could only hide for so long. In December 1942, David was finally found without papers or identification and transported in a cattle car to a place called Auschwitz in Poland. The Germans called it Auschwitz. My grandfather had never heard of Auschwitz, but he quickly found out how cruel and horrible the place would be. They took away his name and replaced it with a number, prisoner 83526, the number tattooed on his forearm. His first job in the concentration camp was to take a wheelbarrow and collect the bodies of other prisoners who committed suicide. This was gruesome work. And my grandfather tells me, had he continued doing this job day after day, he would have never survived it. After a few weeks, word started to circulate in the camp that prisoner 83526 could sing. The cell block leader began to coerce David to entertain in the barracks, going through the catalog of every song he knew from his days performing as a young boy. David would sing German songs, English songs, even a Yiddish song that was popular at the time. Bei mir bist du schön. Occasionally, David would be rewarded with a few extra pieces of bread. And eventually, he was brought in front of a crowd of drunken Nazi soldiers and told to serve as their evening entertainment. My grandfather was terrified. He was auditioning for his life. He has explained to me that while he may have been singing there for the Nazis in Auschwitz, in his mind, he was back home singing in the Great Lamatzke Temple. He would picture his synagogue congregation and all the people that he knew before him. Behind him would be the choir of familiar faces, and he had the solo. But here he was, singing for his Nazi captors. And the Nazis, they loved it. So because of his remarkable voice, he became what he calls a privileged prisoner. Now, to be a privileged prisoner in a place like Auschwitz basically meant that you were only a little more likely than other prisoners to live to see another day. And that became his mantra, just another day, just another day. He was given a new job working in the warm clothing sauna, inspecting and disinfecting the belongings taken from new arrivals to the camp. Sometimes guards would give him extra bits of food, but even being a privileged prisoner, he could not avoid an extreme punishment for doing something like missing morning roll call. A mistake for which he was beaten within an inch of his life, scars he still has on his body to this day. For 2.5 years, my grandfather continued on like this. It was rare to survive in Auschwitz this long. While others around him were killed or disappeared, my grandfather kept saying to himself, just another day, just another day. But another day was never guaranteed. The Germans escalated the pace of prisoner transports. Day and night, my grandfather would watch the packed train cars arrive, thousands of people at a time, men, women, and children, herded directly to the back of the camp towards the crematoria buildings the prisoners themselves had been forced to build. The Nazis were not even selecting workers anymore. These people were delivered directly to their death in a gas chamber. And the trains did not stop. They just kept coming and coming, more and more and more. During this time, World War II was raging, so the Germans were also engaged in battles all across Europe, fighting on a lot of fronts. And the tide had turned against them. As the Germans grew increasingly desperate in 1945, the Nazis tried to hide their atrocities. They started to empty out the concentration camps. And prisoners were marched out of Auschwitz in rows of 5, my grandfather among them. It was freezing cold. The prisoners had been overworked and underfed, many beaten and sick, and they were wearing very little clothes. These were death marches, because the guards did not seem to care if any prisoners died along the way. My grandfather made it to another concentration camp, Dachau, before he was to be shortly transferred by train to yet another location. And it was during this transport when some planes roared overhead and shot at the train. It was the Allied forces unaware that prisoners were part of this train cargo. Bombs and heavy gunfire rained down, causing the train to stop on the tracks. The train was badly damaged, the rear car blown apart. The prisoners were forced out and ordered to lay low in a ravine while the Nazi soldiers tended to the train. A few armed guards stood watch over the prisoners, but the guards were few in number and spread far apart, and they too were tired. As David lay face down in the ravine, his hands over his head, his fingers came upon something sharp, metal in the grass. It was a farm tool, a small shovel that some farmer must have left behind. My grandfather took this as a sign. This was his chance. He waited for the right moment when the nearest guard had his back turned. David snuck up behind the guard, shovel gripped tightly in his hands, and smacked the guard as hard as he could in the back of the neck. The guard crumpled to the ground. In an instant, other prisoners nearby leapt up and scattered, and David ran as if his feet were not even touching the ground, as fast as he could, as far as he could. David kept running until he found himself in the woods, alone, free. He found an abandoned barn where he scrounged up some stale bread and moldy cheese. He ate, slept, and hid during the day, and moved under the cover of night. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he followed the sound of gunfire. Maybe if he could get to where the fighting was happening, he could make it to the other side, to the side fighting the Germans. After the second night, just as dawn was breaking and he was getting ready to find another place to hide, my grandfather heard a great rumble off in the distance. He climbed a small hill to get a better look. There below, almost as far as the eye could see, snaked a column of tanks, jeeps, and army trucks. But it was too far away to make out the exact markings on the vehicles to know which army this belonged to. And as the entourage barreled down the highway, it got close enough to where he could see the outline of stars. No Nazi swastika, stars. My grandfather bolted down the hill, running with all the force in his tired body towards the column of tanks, nearly tripping over himself, ending up right in the middle of the highway. Imagine, in the middle of the morning, a young, dirty teenager jumping in front of an entire army. The entire column of jeeps and tanks and trucks stopped cold. As my grandfather describes it, the lid of the lead tank opened up, and out popped the captain of the United States 101st Airborne 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment, James L. Walker from South Carolina. My grandfather knew a lot of languages, but never in his life had he heard anything like that thick Southern American drawl. In broken phrases, my grandfather was able to tell them where he had come from, that he had desperately escaped the Nazis. Right there, the army scooped him up, and he traveled with that unit as they went from town to town, liberating each one from the defeated German forces. My grandfather improved his English, and the army put his knowledge of languages to work as a translator. After a short while, he was presented with his own U.S. Army uniform. The group adopted him as their little Davy. He was one of them. Eager to leave behind such horrible experiences and painful memories, my grandfather decided he was now American. He stayed with the army until the end of the war, and he physically left Europe behind when his army buddies brought him home with them in 1946, their ship landing in Hoboken, New Jersey. My grandfather quickly set about finding his Aunt Ruth and Aunt Helen, his mother's sisters who had made it out of Poland before the war. They were living in New York City, and they took David in. My grandfather embraced his new American lifestyle, and he even found a nice Jewish girl from Brooklyn to settle down with. Her name was Hope, my grandmother. Together, they had a son, Eric, my father. They moved to the suburbs of Philadelphia to raise their family and found a budding Jewish community in Levittown, Pennsylvania. The synagogue there had a rabbi, but no cantor. So my grandfather volunteered on a few Friday nights. The congregation leaders were so impressed that he knew so much and wowed by his regal, old-world singing style. Soon enough, they hired him full-time. And after all he had been through, my grandfather again had found his community, and he was able to lead them in song. My grandfather continued singing as a cantor for the next 50 years. And this is how I know my grandfather. This is how I think of him, as the cantor, the singer. I grew up going to synagogue to hear him chant from the Torah and sing prayers with his beautiful, bellowing voice. Over the years, as I grew into my own musician, that love of music bonded us to each other. He would teach me songs from his childhood, and we began performing together. A few years ago, he asked me to accompany him back to Poland. There was to be a grand ceremony commemorating the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz for Holocaust Remembrance Day. In attendance were world leaders, government officials, journalists, historians, educators, and former prisoners. It was broadcast to a global audience of millions. It was held on the grounds of the concentration camp. My grandfather stepped up to the podium to lead us all in prayer, a Hebrew prayer for the departed. Behind him stood the archway known as the Death Gate of Auschwitz-Birkenau, where 70 years earlier, he had witnessed the trains deliver thousands upon thousands of people to their death. At this ceremony, I witnessed as my grandfather stood, and in full voice, he sang, no longer as a prisoner, as a survivor. For many years, my grandfather did not open up about what happened to him in the Holocaust. Not with anyone, not even his family. But slowly, over time, as we kept asking questions and as he was encouraged by others in the community, he started to tell us stories, vignettes, bits and pieces of what he went through, as he was able, when we were ready to listen. The stories about his parents and brothers, though, those stories about his childhood before the war, those were some of the memories he kept most hidden from us, locked away in a corner of his heart. So when he invited me to go to Poland with him, I felt like here was a chance for me to get to know as much as I could about what happened to him, to his family, to my family, to understand where I come from and how such a thing could have even occurred. My grandfather's memoir is called One Voice, Two Lives because he describes it as having lived two lives, one before the war and one after the war. The years of the Holocaust, that was not living. And when he and I traveled together, I experienced these two lives overlapping as we traced his journey through Poland. We traveled to the site of his childhood home in Sochachev, where little save for a trace of his childhood is maybe an old, desecrated cemetery. We stayed in Warsaw, performing a concert at the new Polin Museum, which is dedicated to Poland Jewish history, built on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto itself. We said the mourner's Kaddish prayer for his family, his parents and his brothers, on a Warsaw street corner. We took a commuter train through the Polish countryside to the town of Oswiecim. And we ended up where my grandfather ended up, in Auschwitz. Imagine escaping hell and returning. I tried. I was on a bus approaching Auschwitz, drawing nearer to the original iron gate entrance that displays the German words Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. Sitting next to my grandfather, watching him as we slowly passed by the wooden shelf bunks of Birkenau where he slept as a prisoner in the concentration camp for nearly 3 years of his life. And I could not imagine what it was like for him. I tried, and I continue to try. We will never know or be able to quantify the magnitude of what was lost in the Holocaust. Not just the lives, but the careers, the achievements, the art, the ideas. But there were moments on our travels around Poland where my grandfather realized that things he thought were lost were not really gone for good, not completely. Like when we celebrated a Friday night Shabbat service with a small Jewish community in Warsaw, trying to revitalize Jewish life in the city. Or like when my grandfather sang a song in Polish, which he composed while a prisoner in Auschwitz, performing for a rapt audience packed to capacity in the museum auditorium, embodying the star of Poland he was always meant to be. Or like the day we were getting ready to take a tour around Auschwitz, my grandfather turned to me and he said, "You are proof that Hitler did not win." And I realized I am a part of my grandfather's story. My grandfather lost so much of his family, but that was not the end. All of us, his 4 children, his 6 grandchildren, we are the continuation of his story. And through us, his voice will live on.
What I have, thank God, is a beautiful family here. A wife now for 69 years, and I love to say I still have hope. That's her name, Hope. And my grandson, thank God, happens to be quite a pianist. He finally, after many tries of all kinds of composers, to translate my song from Polish to English, he did it about a couple of months ago, and now we have it in English, and I'm going to perform it tonight. Go ahead. I remember it so clearly, my days in Auschwitz. Got out alive just nearly, and still the name stings. Still I see that place, enduring like the scars I can't erase. Appell, Abstand, mitten ab, that's German. Hear the sharp ears call. You wish you were just never born at all. Auschwitz, through pain and sickness, always working Auschwitz. With death behind you, always lurking Auschwitz, Auschwitz. Evil like some twisted dream. Never mind the hope of fleeing. Hunger is the only feeling. Auschwitz. Like numbers on my arm, it lingers. Auschwitz. I curse you with my broken fingers. Auschwitz, Auschwitz. Heart be hard as stone. Hatred is the greenest weed you've grown. That's how. Have a little respect for the next person. Don't care who they are, because Actually, prejudice, hate, winds up being death.
Prejudice, hate, winds up being death. When my grandfather first arrived in the United States, he still had his Auschwitz prisoner number tattooed on his forearm, 83526. He went through an expensive and painful plastic surgery procedure to have it removed. His arm was sliced and sewn in such a way that the skin kept pulling together as it tried to heal, and he couldn't sleep for a year. Today, still, a curve of the 6, that last digit, remains. And that tattoo is such a cruel metaphor of the legacy of the Holocaust. Even after being liberated from hell, these prisoners are never fully free. How deep does the ink go? The prisoner tattoo was just another device used by the Nazis to strip away the humanity from the people they sought to persecute. Because it's easier to be cruel when you stop regarding another human being as a human being. My grandfather's story is full of examples of what happens when we stop regarding one another as human beings. But his story is also full of examples of those that reached out to help, those that remembered their shared humanity, those that recognized how we are responsible for one another. We are responsible for one another. It is the ongoing work of every day to stand up to prejudice and hate, and we must be honest and do the work to recognize it even within ourselves. We take a first step by sharing our stories with each other and listening, really listening to each other. So I want to thank the museum and Alana, Richard, and Carl for inviting me to share this story today. And I want to thank all of you for listening. Our voices are powerful. Now you have heard my grandfather's voice. What will you do with yours?
Thank you so much, Avi, for this very powerful story and for sharing your grandfather's legacy with us. It's remarkable to hear him on video and to see you two together in Poland. We have several questions from the audience, so I'll direct those to you.
Sure.
One of them, you touched upon his sentiments on how he felt going forward about hate. But one question comes in and it says, how did your family feel about the Polish people given the anti-Semitism he suffered and the collaboration with the Germans by some Poles?
It's a really difficult history to reconcile with. Right, both there's what my grandfather experiences and what he feels and what our family feels, and they're similar and they're different. But one thing I try and do is take cues from my grandfather, and I got to see that firsthand as we traveled with him. And I remember there was actually a young German journalist who was asking him a question and interviewing him, and she was describing this kind of shame and guilt that she felt. And it was such a powerful conversation to see between the two of them. And he said, you know, I don't blame German people now. We all have a choice with whatever we do to help or to further hate and prejudice. And each person makes their choice. But it's not on us to say, as a group of people, right, to paint them all with one brush. because that's also what perpetuated the Holocaust, to paint an entire group of people with one brush. And so it's, I think also for my grandfather and for our family, when we went back to Poland, it's that push and pull of, yes, there was anti-Semitism then, and there certainly is anti-Semitism now, even in Poland, but there's also a resurgence of Judaism and a resurgence of acceptance of Jews into Polish society. There are a number of a number of non-Jews that we met actually who had converted to Judaism or found that they had Jewish roots and were kind of finding their way back into it. So it's that kind of hope that you hold on to, and to remember that any group of people, you can't paint them with one brush, and that it's, you know, hopefully you encourage people to accept and to teach them that we have more in common than we have different.
Yeah, that's so important. It's like the danger of a single story, right? We have to recognize how complicated people are in so many ways, that you can't just assume, can't just apply one thought or one theory to a whole group.
That's right. People are complicated and history is complicated. And I've learned that in talking about the Holocaust, there's nothing simple about it. Everything is complicated because it's such an unthinkable scenario that happened, that each little decision impacted so many people, and you were put in these impossible situations. So
that is so true. There is nothing simple about the Holocaust. Well, you mentioned in your presentation that there were several people along the way who helped your grandfather, and it sounds like even from the very beginning, when he went running to his non-Jewish friend for help. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the people who reached out and helped him along the way?
yes, so I mean, there are so many different parts of his story that are amazing. There are so many amazing stories within his amazing story. And there was one of those non-Jewish people who helped him escape to Warsaw after he got out of the ghetto, was a friend, Wanda, who we've been unable to find. And actually, when we went back to Poland, he was looking for her, but he was a child and all he knew of her was her first name. So we don't have a last name. And there were several people that worked at his father's factory who were non-Jewish, who were willing to help him when he went back to his hometown. And they all contributed to saving his life. Those people in the United States Army contributed to saving his life. And you mentioned at the start of this program that there was a woman in the camp of Auschwitz that was mentioned in the New York Times. There was a woman, an older woman, who was a Hungarian Jewish prisoner. And they had a relationship in the camp. And this is something we didn't know up until recently, really, until his memoir was published, that there was this woman, there was a relationship there, and she had been around long enough in the camp where she had some power, some clout, that she had access to the transport lists of all the prisoners they were transporting out. And of course, if you were transported out of the camp at that time, there was likely that you would either die or disappear and never be heard from again. So she actually took his name off the transport list, his number, 83526. And that's one of the reasons why he was able to survive so long in Auschwitz, because she was kind of looking out for him. And we were only able to really know this and verify this just a couple of years ago, where they were finally able to find each other and reunite. I drove my grandfather into New York City, where she ended up. She was just about 100 years old. My grandfather was about a little over 90 at the time. And they were able to reunite and to actually discuss this moment. My grandfather asked her, did you save my life? I had a feeling that you had something to do with me staying in Auschwitz. and she raised her hand like this. She couldn't really talk very much or move, but she raised her hand and she said, 5 times, I took your name off the list. And it's amazing because you hear so many of the stories of the Holocaust where people don't know what happened to their family, don't even know what happened to them or why things happened to them. And this was one small instance of actual closure that I think they both were able to have for each other. And it was really a beautiful thing to be able to see.
I mean, it's just an absolutely remarkable story. There was another piece of that story. For those of you who are listening, if you haven't heard the podcast or read the article in the New York Times, I suggest you do so. But there's another really powerful piece of that story where she waited for him after the war. Can you tell us that story?
Yes. So this is certainly falls under the category of complicated scenarios that occur during a time like the Holocaust. When in Auschwitz, they were actually able to be together and confide in each other and give each other comfort. And they sort of made an arrangement that if they ever got out of the camp, that they would try and meet up, I believe, at a Jewish community center or somewhere that they both were familiar with, somewhere in Poland. But of course, their paths took very different turns, and my grandfather was transported out of Auschwitz, and he ended up with the army, and she ended up liberated and in a displaced person camp called Feldafing. And she was with her brother and a friend of theirs, and neither of them knew what happened to the other. And it was only at this reunion 70 years later when my grandfather and her were actually having this conversation, and he found out that she did save his life a number of times, that she actually went to that place, that meeting place that they had arranged. And this conversation about why they didn't meet up and why their paths didn't cross and how they both ended up having separate families. And what could have been, I hesitate to call it a love story because who knows what it is, and what it would have been. These are two people that should have actually never met each other because of the circumstance where they were, and yet how amazing that they were able to give each other comfort and to be something for each other in that moment. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it really speaks to just the complicated nature of how lives were thrown together in this moment and lives were torn apart. And what do you do with all those pieces afterwards, right? It's not just during your time in Auschwitz, but afterwards, this ripple effects through lives and through generations.
Mm-hmm. And just these extreme circumstances. I think it also shows just the power of human nature in even the most extreme circumstances. There's a comment here from Nancy, and she writes, I believe I grew up listening to your grandfather at Temple Bethel in Levittown, Pennsylvania. His voice was beautiful and he spoke of the Holocaust during some services. Is this possible? This was in the 1960s.
Yes, it is. It's very possible. Levittown, Pennsylvania. My grandfather was at a number of congregations, and I'm not sure if this temple was one where he was a cantor, but I know he has sung many times all over the tri-state area and beyond. And eventually, little by little, he did start sharing his story more and more at different places, at universities and at synagogues. And I think one of the greatest joys for him is when especially students and people he taught and he helped usher into bar bat mitzvah, or people he officiated weddings for, when they reach out and they tell him what an impact he has had on their life. And it's amazing that there are so many people whose lives he has touched over the years, first with his music and now with his story, that he's willing and able to share his story, and it's really powerful. So that's amazing. I'm sure it was the same Cantor Wisnia, and I'm sure he would love to hear from you.
So Avi, one last question here to wrap us up. There's a question here from Gary, and he says, I am a composer and filmmaker. How can I spread stories like your grandfather's?
That's a wonderful thing. Thank you. I will say, with regard to my grandfather's story, and I saw there may have been another question about where you can read more about him. He does have a website that our family has created for him to help get his story out there. It's called onevoice2lives.com. And his memoir is there, and we've also posted some of these videos. You saw snippets of some of them today. You can read more about his story and more about the music that he composed and the music that he sings and the music that we perform together. And there are so many remarkable stories about the Holocaust. Each one so uniquely different. No Holocaust story is the same. So the more that we can hear, I think the better, especially to keep these memories alive. That's why I feel so strongly about helping keep my grandfather's story alive, because we don't want this lost to history, all of this suffering and everything that people have gone through. And there are wonderful, wonderful resources like the Holocaust Center for Humanity, where I would encourage you to share videos and share stories and to ask people. One of the things that really encouraged my grandfather to share his story was people asking. And I think for a long time in the United States and elsewhere, I think my grandfather felt like people didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to hear about that stuff, what happened to him. But slowly over time, as people have encouraged him to speak about it, I think that's the most important thing, is for victims of the Holocaust and any victims, that we let them know that when they are ready to tell their story, we will be ready to listen. And that's the best thing that we all can do.
Wonderful. Avi, it has been such an honor to have you with us today. And thank you for bringing your grandfather's story forward and sharing it with all of us. We're so grateful that you are continuing this legacy. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor.
I shared the website in the chat, so if anyone's looking for more information, please check out the website. Of course, check out Avi's amazing music on his own website, where you can hear him sing. That was one of the questions we didn't get to, Avi, which was, would you perform a song for us? But we'll send people to the website in the interest of time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. The program was recorded, and you can find it on our website starting tomorrow with all of the other past Lunch and Learn programs. The views, information, or opinions expressed in these programs are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the Holocaust Center for Humanity. Thank you again to Carl Schutoff for introducing me to Avi Wisnia. And I want to give a special thank you to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, who's running the technical side of this show. Also, a huge thank you to our Executive Director, Dee Simon, who steers the ship. And thank you to our entire team, Lori Werschel-Cohen, Nicole Bella, Julia Thompson, Paul Regelbrug, Ellie Selesky, Amanda Davis, Rick Brewer, Katie Lawrence, Morgan Romero, Craig Verniest, and Devonshire Locke. This strong team makes all of these programs possible. Please join us again next week on Tuesday at the same time to hear from filmmakers Michael Clevin and Elta Hatala as they share the making of their new film called The Train I Missed. It's a miraculous story of survival, family, and community, and the documentary follows the journey of a retired Dutch businessman as he revisits his experiences as a hidden child during the Holocaust. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next week. This concludes our program for today.